I took the train from Washington, D.C. to New York City. It's here where hijackers rammed airline jets into the World Trade Center towers on September 11, 2001. 2 other flights crashed into the Pentagon and into an empty field in Pennsylvania on that day. In all, nearly 3,000 people were killed in those attacks. Professor, as you walk through the streets of New York, it obviously probably brings you back to that day, that Tuesday, 9/11. What was that like here in New York?
Well, there was an incredible amount of shock and grief when 9/11 happened. I mean, everyone was bewildered, wondering what happened. And as you walked out in the street, you could, of course, almost like feel the ash in the air. So it was a really traumatic moment.
And that day seared in your memory forever, isn't it?
Yes, and for me, I got a chance to be, as they say, literally at the center of history at that moment, because Singapore was a member of the UN Security Council when 9/11 happened. And what's remarkable is that the whole world came together to support America when 9/11 happened. And especially the UN Security Council, which of course is the world's most powerful international organization, because the UN Security Council is the only body that can make decisions that are mandatory and binding on all member states. And the UN Security Council swung into action almost immediately and started supporting the United States and said, we are with you in this struggle. And in fact, China was among the first to come out and support the United States and say, we stand with you in this fight.
We're determined to fight this evil and fight until we're rid of it. We will not wait for more innocent deaths.
Then U.S. President George W. Bush immediately called for a global war on terror. Later that same year, China became a member of the World Trade Organization. In the following years, the path each country took was quite different. I discussed the strategies of these 2 countries with veteran diplomat Kishore Mahbubani.
Well, in my book, Has the West Lost It?, I point out to 2 major strategic mistakes that the West made. And also I documented in my TED Talk. The first was in the year around 1990, when the Cold War ended, when the West, including the United States, chose to go to sleep as a result of Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, at precisely the time when China and India were waking up. And then in the year 2001, of course, was the terrible 9/11 attacks. I was in Manhattan when the attacks happened. And so the United States went all out on a kind of a military offensive and started wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and all that. But something more significant happened that year, which is that China joined the WTO. So instead of dealing with the global consequences of China's joining of WTO, and that would be what they call in economics creative destruction, when you inject 900 million new workers in the global capitalist system, you should adjust and adapt. But the United States failed to adjust and adapt to those changes. So as an Indian diplomat remarked to me, if you look back over the last 20 years, the United States has been fighting wars without winning them, and China has been winning without fighting. And China is the only country which hasn't fought a major war in 40 years since the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. And China actually hasn't even fired one bullet across its borders since 1989, when there was a naval skirmish in Vietnam in the South China Sea. So China has been strategically very disciplined, following, I guess, Sun Tzu's old advice, the best way to win wars is not to fight them. Whereas the United States has become, unfortunately, sadly, and I say this as a friend of the United States, has become trigger happy. and has got involved in conflict after conflict after conflict without serving any real national interests of the American people. In fact, one of the key arguments about my forthcoming book is that the United States really should stop fighting unnecessary wars.
Professor Mahbubani is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He was twice Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and served as president of the UN Security Council. His articles have appeared in globally renowned journals and newspapers like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Financial Times, and the New York Times. In Kishore's book, Has the West Lost It?, he argues that the West can no longer impose its ideology on the world, and more importantly, it must stop intervening in the affairs of other nations.
Has the West lost everything? And my answer is that it's not too late. It is possible for the West to recover and come back in strength.
So, Professor, your TED Talk, I think, probably garnered a lot of interest. And I was struck by two words you talked about and two words that perhaps the West should be focused on. You talked about arrogance and hubris instead of adjusting and adapting. Talk to us about that. I mean, has that been a fatal flaw in a sense?
Well, I think the critical point I tried to make in my TED Talk is that we're entering a completely new era of world history. Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and America took off. So the past 200 years of world history, when you view them against the backdrop of the past 2,000 years of world history, have been a major historical aberration. Now, all aberrations come to a natural end. So it's perfectly natural to see the return of China and India. And so clearly the time had come for the West to make adjustments and adapt to this new world. But by a very strange accident of history, which future historians will be very puzzled by, the West chose to go to sleep at precisely the moment when China and India decided to wake up. And that, I think, is one of the biggest strategic mistakes that the West made. And my goal in my books and interviews is to try and help the West adjust to this new world that has emerged.
And you even allude to that in the TED Talk about Napoleon and his famous quote about China taking a short nap, I guess.
Yes, well, Napoleon famously said, let China sleep, for when she awakes, she will shake the world. And paradoxically, it was the West that woke up China. Because, in the 19th century, when the West became so much more powerful than China, and even though China told the West, go away, leave me alone, the West decided, no, we're going to seize your territory, we're going to force you to take opium. And so as a result of that, the West woke up China, and it took China a long time to adjust and adapt to this new modern world. So it was an incredibly painful, long journey before China woke up and adjusted and adapted to the world where the West was dominant. And paradoxically today, it is now the West that is resisting change and refusing to adapt to the new world.
In 1995, the World Trade Organization was formed. As the largest international economic organization, it's played a crucial role in regulating trade between nations. When trade disputes come up, the WTO mediates these disagreements through a panel of 7 judges, perhaps its most important role. The isolationist policies of U.S. President Donald Trump's administration are spreading to the rest of the world. Trump has crippled the WTO by not approving new judges. Now the WTO's dispute settlement system is at risk of collapsing.
Great thing for the American worker.
You mentioned the WTO, and I know you've quoted Bill Clinton in the past and about what he's had to say about the WTO. It's interesting, instead of strengthening the WTO, what we're seeing now is a weakening of the WTO from the perspective of the United States. I mean, we've got this appellate court where they refuse to assign. I mean, they should be going in one direction, and yet they're going in the reverse of what you would recommend, or Clinton for that matter.
On the WTO, fortunately, there is bad news and good news. The bad news is that, of course, the Trump administration has decided that it doesn't trust the WTO and is trying very hard to paralyze the WTO, and in fact especially paralyze the dispute settlement procedures by vetoing the appointment of new judges on the appellate courts. So that's a negative development, and I think also the Trump administration has been trying very hard to avoid using the WTO as a mechanism for global trade liberalization. But at the same time, when the United States decided under the Trump administration to retreat from free trade and retreat from free trade agreements, the rest of the world could have done the same. But surprisingly, and this is a very pleasant surprise, the rest of the world is proceeding with free trade agreements even without the United States. So for example, when the United States walked away from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the other 11 members could have said, deal over, let's forget it. Instead, they carried on, led by Japan, that has been emerged. And more recently, the world's largest free trade agreement has been signed involving the 10 ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia and New Zealand. India was supposed to join, but pulled out at the last minute. But that is still the world's largest free trade agreement, and it was announced just 2 months ago. So that's a sign of how the world is proceeding with global trade liberalization, even though the United States is backtracking from the WTO.
In 2003, 2 years after his presidency ended, U.S. President Bill Clinton warned that America would need to prepare for a time when it would no longer be the world's largest power.
Well, I think Bill Clinton was the one who tried, I think very wisely, to advise his fellow Americans that he said, if America is going to be number one forever, then fine, we can keep on doing what we are doing. You're strong, we can do whatever we want to do. But then he added a but. He said, but if we can conceive of a world where America is no longer number one, then surely it is in America's national interest to try and strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral procedures, multilateral institutions, so that at the end of the day, you get a more safer and more stable world when America becomes number two. But as you know, sadly, no one listened to Bill Clinton.
They listened to another gentleman named Donald Trump who says, I'm going to make America great again. And he's going to do it by pulling back. Instead of multilateralism, it's unilateral. How much of a setback is this administration for the United States if they were to pivot and move in the right direction? I mean, they're also trying to weaken these global institutions. So you were a big part of the United Nations. He doesn't believe in that either.
One lesson I learned from history is that it's always too early to tell what the long-term consequences will be, of anything that happens. It's sort of surprises do occur. But I think at the same time, I think the United States will find that the rest of the world, which used to be in many ways closely integrated with the United States and trying to follow the United States when the United States was the strongest supporter of multilateral institutions, especially after World War II. In fact, all the major global multilateral institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, are gifts from the United States and Europe to the rest of the world. And so when the United States had to walk away from the gifts it presented to the rest of the world could also have chosen to walk away from the gifts, but they're not doing so. And they are in fact continuing to work with all these multilateral institutions. And we hope that at some point in time, the United States will heed the advice of Bill Clinton and go back to strengthening multilateral institutions. But the rest of the world is not going to join the United States in walking away from them. And it'd be very sad to see a world where the United States becomes relatively isolated. As Ronald Reagan famously said, tear down the wall, Mr. Gorbachev, right? And now, paradoxically, the rest of the world is tearing down walls, and the United States is building walls. And that future historians will be very puzzled by why the world's most open society is now deciding to build walls.
Prime Minister Lee and Mr.
When the Cold War ended, the United States worked closely with Southeast Asia.
Nancy and I welcome you to the White House. It was a great pleasure for me today to renew a valued friendship with Prime Minister Lee. I first met the Prime Minister on a trip that I took on behest of President Nixon. And when we stopped in Singapore, I was amazed at the dynamic society that I found there. How could a country with such a small area and few resources be making such strides? And then I met Prime Minister Lee, and my questions were answered.
Lee Kuan Yew was one of the founding fathers of Singapore and a close personal friend of U.S. President Ronald Reagan. The two often met at the White House.
Take us inside that meeting that Lee Kuan Yew had with Ronald Reagan, because I think it gives a lot of insights into how the West sees things and the critical thinking of Lee Kuan Yew.
Well, I mean, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had a lot of respect for President Ronald Reagan, although they were very, very different as personalities. I was in the White House when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew called on President Reagan, and the contrast between the two gentlemen could not have been more stark, because while Lee Kuan Yew was giving a very serious, complex analysis of the geopolitical situation in the world at the height of the Cold War, President Ronald Reagan would sort of break into the conversation by talking about the problems that the Queen of England was having with her horses. So it was a very remarkable contrast, but at the same time, I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was aware that Ronald Reagan was a very shrewd politician, and also someone who played the geopolitical game very well, because he tried to avoid getting America involved in unnecessary conflicts, which is a habit that America has lost.